Simon, and welcome to my crib. Oh, I'm dizzy. Welcome to another lesson of biology. Let's get into it. So, we are continuing our discussion of evolution. So, in the last lesson, we kind of talked about what things can we look at on Earth that tell us that evolution has been and is continually occurring here on Earth. Okay. However, in today's lesson, our goal is to explain adaptation, explain fitness, explain natural selection, and essentially be able to describe and analyze scenarios of each. Okay. We also want to be able to describe how natural selection produces change in populations, right? So changes populations, but an individual in an individual's lifetime cannot evolve, right? We're going to learn about what that means. So just to recap, talk about evolution, how everything is connected, right? We have everything came from common ancestors. Everything that we see here on Earth came from a common ancestor, right? And that's why we see like so many similarities between each other, right? Evolution, descent with modification, changes. So this idea of common ancestry is seen in many ways, but especially within our DNA, right? So between a human and a banana, about 60% of our DNA is exactly identical, Okay. So much of DNA is used just for like cellular processes that our cells and a banana's cells are doing the exact same things, right? So they're gonna have about 60% of the same DNA. Between a human and a cat is about 90%. Okay, so between you and your pet cat, you have 90% of the same DNA, right? Okay, between a human and a chimpanzee is about 96%. So if you've noticed, between all these organisms that we've been going through, we're getting a little bit more and more closer related, right? If our DNA is more similar to each other, then we're probably going to have a common ancestor, probably going to be more closely related. Okay, between you and I, okay, you and I, there's about 99.9% of DNA genetic similarity, right? That 0.1% is those key things that give us our height, our weight, our health levels, stuff like that, okay? So, by looking at DNA sequences, they can give us an idea of how closely related organisms are to one another. This is evidence of evolution, right? That's evidence of evolution. So just to recap the last lesson, and this is just directly a screenshot from my Quizlet. So make sure that you are using the Quizlet because it's very, as you can see, it's very like easily broken down exactly what you need to know. So evidence of evolution, it shows how evidence of evolution is how we know evolution exists and how we know that it is occurring constantly. This is evidence that it exists and how we know that it is occurring constantly over thousands and thousands and millions of years, right? So the first piece of evidence that we usually will talk about is going to be fossils, right? We see fossils, that shows us that something used to live here. That organism doesn't exist anymore because it was a common ancestor of something else that is currently living, but that organism did exist and it left a fossil, right? So fossils tell us about organisms that used to live. But looking at the embryos, we can look at developmental structures, which are coded by the DNA, homologous structures. So like we have arm bones that look like whales, look like humans, or look like cats and dogs, right? But they all have the same basic structure, right? Same basic, 4 or 5 bones, but we do vastly different things. But that shows that there's a common ancestor. Okay, similar DNA sequences, and of course vestigial structures. So the vestigial structures are going to be things that are no longer useful to the organism. For example, the pelvic walking bones in whales. Whales don't walk, but they still have walking bones, right? That's evidence that evolution is constantly occurring across millions of years. So again, the last lesson we looked at evidence and concluded that evolution does occur naturally over time. This lesson today, we're going to look at the driving force behind evolution. Okay, so the last lesson was basically like what exactly is evolution? How do we know that it's happening? And then this lesson is about what is actually causing evolution to occur. Okay, so we're going to play a game. So in a little bit, I'm going to give you a link. Okay, and on that link, you're going to click on this peppered moth game and you're going to click play game. Then it's going to ask you to choose a forest for your experiment. The first one that we're going to choose is going to be this light forest, okay? So the light forest is what we're going to choose. Okay, so basically, the way that this game works is that you're going to be in a forest and it's going to put a bunch of little moths on it. You're going to see moths flying in and landing and flying out and landing and all of that. And essentially, what you need to do is you need to click on them with your mouse or tap them on if you have a touch screen, and you're going to basically eat the moths. Okay, you're going to eat as many as you can. Okay, in the very beginning of the game, it's going to give you about half and half, dark and light moths, and then you're going to eat up moths, and it's going to show you the populations, how it's changing over time. Okay, but before we actually begin, what do you expect will survive and reproduce more in the light forest? Do you think dark moths will survive and reproduce more here, or light moths? Okay, so go ahead and click that link to play the game and come back when you're finished. All right, so hopefully everyone just played the game. So I ate 30 moths. Did you beat me? Did you eat more dark or light moths? Okay, now I want you to scroll to the bottom of the page. You're going to look at your graphs, which of them have a higher population at the end? Was it light moths or dark moths, and why? Okay, this is what your graph probably should have looked something close to this, maybe not exactly this, but something close to it. Okay, so in the light forest, by the end, you can see light moth population was about 92% and the dark moth population was about 8%. Why? Why is that? Well, of course, the dark moths were easier to see against the light background. Okay, you could easily click on and see all of the dark moths. This means that the predators, so you and I, ate them more often. This reduced their population size, reduced the amount of times they are reproducing, which reduced their gene frequency. Okay, now we're going to do the same game, but this time we're going to choose the dark forest. See, so we're just going to change the environmental conditions and see what happens then. Okay, I want you to scroll to the bottom and look at the graph. We started out with 50% light and 50% dark moths. How many did you end up with? Okay, this is what my results were. Yours might have been a little bit different, just depending on, who you are. Okay, so in the dark forest, which moths would you say were better adapted to survive? Why? Oh, well, probably the dark moths, okay? Because they were better adapted to survive because they had a gene that made them a dark color, which means they were able to blend in with that forest ecosystem very well, which meant that predators couldn't see them, okay? If predators can't see them, they're able to survive more. They're able to survive more. They're probably likely to reproduce more. That means at the end, in their population increases over time. Good job. Okay, so this is a real life example of natural selection. So organisms that have favorable DNA are going to survive more, reproduce more, and therefore increase the frequency of their genes in the population more. Okay, and if you don't know what frequency is just how much of something do you have, right? So frequency means so if something is like has a high frequency, it's happening more often. If something has a low frequency, it's happening less and less often, right? So organisms that have favorable DNA are going to have a high frequency because they're going to be able to survive and reproduce more. Okay? This concept is known as survival of the fittest, natural selection. Okay? However, remember that favorable or good traits depend on that specific environment, right? So the light forest favored light moths. So in the light forest, light moths were selected for. Okay. In the dark forest favored dark moths. They were able to camouflage, right? So that means that the dark forest selected for dark moths. Natural selection explains many things in nature. It actually explains why giraffes have long necks. So in places where giraffes live, there are these really, 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 really tall trees, right? There's these really tall trees giraffes like to eat. So, in a normal population, there's going to be variation, right? So there's going to be differences in every organism. So some organisms are going to be tall, some are going to be short. Okay, the tall ones are going to be able to reach up to that tops of those trees and get that food, while these shorter ones probably won't be able to, and that's why you see that they've died off. Okay, so longer necked giraffes can reach more of a food supply. They're going to survive and reproduce more often than the shorter necked giraffes. Okay, obviously, this is an obvious thing to say, but traits that help an organism's fitness, so helps them survive and reproduce more, will be selected for naturally in nature. So it naturally works, like I said, if a giraffe has a long neck, it can reach more food. If it can reach more food, it's going to survive more often. If it survives more often, it's going to reproduce more often. If it reproduces more often, that means more and more over time, more and more giraffes are going to have long necks. It makes sense, right? Okay, that's what's known as a selective advantage. Okay, this variation. So again, that variation just means that there's differences. So some are going to be short, some are medium, and some are tall. The variation provides an advantage to one of the offspring. So one type, or maybe a couple types, are going to have an advantage. The others are not going to eat. They're going to die off. That means they're not passing on their genes, which means over time, if these are all dying off, then over time, we're going to have more and more tall giraffes, which is what we see today, right? We see more and more very tall, long-necked giraffes. Okay, so let's put it all together step by step. Okay, let's break it down. Break it down real quick. So, step one, all organisms receive DNA from their parents. Okay, within a population, there's going to be genetic variation. That word variation just means that there are differences in the traits. So, look at this example right here. In this population of butterflies, some of them are dark red, some of them are pink, some of them are light blue, some of them are like a bright blue. Okay, so that's just variation. There's differences between them. And that's just by chance. They happen to get DNA that made them that color, just by chance. Okay? So some individuals are born with traits that are going to be good. That naturally happens. Like in the forest example, we talked about the moths. In the light forest, if you're born with a light color wings, then you're more likely to blend in. Camouflage means predators cannot get you. So just by chance, some of them are good and some of them have bad adaptations. Okay? Of course, environmental events. So, for example, predation is an example, disease, whatever. Okay, when environmental events occur, then these good traits are going to allow that specific organism to survive more often than other organisms without that trait. Since they're able to survive more, they're going to reproduce more. That means that their gene frequency, so how often we see their genes in the population, is going to increase. Other organisms with bad traits are going to be killed off and their gene frequency is reduced. So this is another example. So we have like these yellowish and then we have like these tannish butterflies. Obviously, a predator, if I'm a predator and I'm looking at here, I'm probably going to eat this one because I can see it very easily. This one's a little bit harder to see. So boom, if these are getting eaten up, then over time, this gene frequency is going to increase, right? Like our moth graphs, we saw that they increase, while the ones that were able to be seen by predators and got killed off are going to decrease. Their population is going to decrease. This change in gene frequency over time, evolution. Evolution, that is it. Okay? You would say that evolution is driven by natural selection, right? Natural selection is who is a predator selecting to eat. Predator selecting to eat this one. Boom. Is that evolution? No. Evolution is change over time. Evolution is driven by natural selection. So natural selection occurs, then that causes evolution. Okay? So hopefully that's not confusing. If it is, let me know. In what ways can environmental conditions affect natural selection? Well, you may have heard of this thing. That's called antibiotic resistance. Okay, it's a pretty big deal. So antibiotic resistance happens when germs develop the ability to defeat the drugs that are designed to kill them. This means that germs are not killed and they continue to grow, which is why infections that are caused by antibiotic resistant bacteria are very difficult and even sometimes impossible to treat. Well, it's kind of humans' fault. The more that we expose bacteria to these antibiotic drugs that are supposed to kill them, well, the weak bacteria are going to immediately die. They're going to die off. But over time, those stronger and more resistant bacteria are going to survive. If they are surviving more, then they are reproducing more. They are reproducing more than they are going to be higher gene frequency in the population, which means that over time, bacteria are getting more and more resistant to drugs, which means that infections and stuff are getting worse and worse. Also, side note, coronavirus is not a bacteria. It's a virus, okay? They have a totally different set of rules. Viruses are not alive, so they can't do this, okay? Okay, so just some more terminology that you may see on a test or a quiz. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So the antibiotics are a selective pressure, are an environmental pressure that calls for natural selection in favor of the resistant bacteria, right? So if you give them a bunch of drugs, the ones that are going to be weak are going to die, and the ones that are strong are going to be selected for. They're going to raise in the population. This is also known as survival of the fittest. Again, survival of the fittest. So the fittest bacteria are going to survive, they're going to reproduce, and then over time, bacteria are getting stronger and stronger. How can this be an issue for humans? Exactly. So, in what ways does natural selection affect populations? So remember, we talked about natural selection affects populations, not individuals. Okay. So let's look at this graph. So as we can see, this is a phenotype, which just means like what the genes code for. So it codes for their fur color. So some of the mice are going to be a dark brown, some are going to be a medium brown, and some are going to be a light tannish color. Okay? This up here is showing the frequency of their genes in the population. So in the normal distribution is on a bell curve. When you take stats, you'll learn about this. That essentially means that like the extremes are very low frequency, while this middle point, this average type, is going to be a very high frequency. Okay, that's the normal distribution of a population. Okay, we have what is called a stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection just means that these extremes are not selected for. Okay, while the middle, the averages, the mid ranges are going to be selected for. They're going to have a very high frequency. Okay, so the extremes are selected against, while this middle is selected for. We have what's called disruptive selection, which means the middles are going to be selected against, while the extremes are going to be selected for. So the bell curve, instead of looking like that, now looks like a roller coaster. Woo, woo. That's called disruptive selection. And that makes sense because look, this is the normal curve. It looks like it just got disrupted. So now it's interrupted, and boom, it goes again. Disruptive selection. Directional selection is exactly what it sounds like. It just means that the selection moves towards one direction. So it could move this way, so these are more favored, or it could move that way, so these are more favored. Okay, it just depends. Okay, directional selection moves a direction. So again, these kind of sound like their names. Disruptive sounds like it disrupted the middle, right? Stabilizing sounds like it got stable. It's all put in the middle. Okay, try and use the names of the words to remember all these vocab words. I know there's a lot because biology is essentially a vocab class. Okay, now let's clarify some vocabulary. We're going to use my little Quizlet cards and clarify some vocabulary. So, an adaptation is going to be an inherited means through the DNA characteristic, passed on from parents to baby. An adaptation is something that increases survival. Okay, to be better adapted means that you survive more and reproduce more. Okay, so on the Quizlet card, you'll see this little picture in which it talks about this right here is a cactus, and it's showing that it has a widespread root system, which means that it's able to get more water and stuff like that. So it's an adaptation, example of adaptation. Evolution. Evolution is going to be the change in a species over time, also known as descent with modification. Okay. Evidence of evolution is how we know evolution exists and is occurring constantly. Fossils, embryos, homologous structures, similar DNA sequences, and vestigial structures are evidence that we have common ancestry. While a mechanism of evolution is actually what causes a species to evolve, and we haven't talked about these, this actually is our next lesson. We're going to talk about the mechanisms of evolution. So what actually happens to the DNA itself. Genetic variation just means there are different types of DNA, genes, chromosomes, alleles. those all essentially kind of mean the same thing. They're all are just DNA, terms for DNA in a species or population. So genetic variation. Fitness is how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. So better adapted means more fit. So you'll notice that a lot of these words basically kind of mean the same thing. Just so you know what I mean. Natural selection is survival of the fittest. So organisms that have favorable DNA are going to survive more, reproduce more, and increase the frequency of their genes in the population more. Okay, so yeah, that's that on the vocab. Hopefully that clarifies. But again, like I said, a lot of these things kind of mean the same thing. So you may need to spend some time on the Quizlet and whatnot, like kind of practicing what exactly they mean. Okay, look at the pictures that I put in the Quizlet as well, because they're really good pictures that really help. Okay, so let's just wrap it all up with one final example of the cartoon. So this is some sort of ecosystem in which a population of mice has moved into a new area where rocks are very dark. As you can see, the rocks are very dark. Due to natural genetic variation, just due to random chance, some of the mice are black while some of them are tan. Okay, this bird right here is a predator. Some of the mice are going to get eaten by the bird. Some of them are going to get eaten. That's just, food chains, trophic levels. Okay, so of course, as the bird swoops down, the bird is going to eat up the tan mice because they're more visible, while the black mice are going to be camouflaged. Okay, only the mice that survive are going to reach the age of reproduction and leave offspring. So the mice are going to reproduce and they're going to give us our next generation of mice. Because the black mice had a higher chance of surviving and leaving offspring than tan mice, the next generation contains a higher fraction of black mice than the previous generation. So you can compare. This is the first generation, in which they looks like there's mostly tan and a few black, but then all the tan ones pretty much died. So then the black ones were the ones that were producing more offspring. So over time, they have more gene frequency. Okay? So that's just kind of the concept of it. That is the concept of it. Okay, so today's virtual notebook is a little bit different. I like the slide idea, but I wanted to change it up because I don't know. I feel like we're going to try it out. Okay, that's all we're going to do. We're going to try it out. I'm not going to make any predictions. We're just going to try it out. So basically, you're going to go on there. It'll still say virtual notebook, okay? And instead of being a slides, it's going to be a worksheet type. It's going to be worksheet type. There's still going to be, like, this looks kind of scary. There's still going to be pictures and whatnot. It's still going to be, set up the exact same way, just in a different format. So yeah, you'll do that. One thing to note is that I have put it up to where you can edit after you submit. So let's say like you want to submit it and then later on you want to go back and finish it up. You can do that. Okay, so make sure that you press, submit. Don't just close it out because I don't think it auto saves. So I want you to submit and then come back and work on it again later. Okay, you'll know when I'm about to grade it because I will put on there, I will say grading virtual notebooks 24 hours from now. So you have 24 hours to try and finish up whatever you can. That way you'll know before I close it out to where you can't edit anymore. Okay, after you submit it, you should be able to see your missed questions. So if you want to go back and edit and fix those missed questions, you're more than welcome to do that. Okay, that's why I'm trying to make sure that we're learning. And also I feel like this would be good for you to study for the test and whatnot. I feel like it's a little bit better than me trying to grade 150 student slides plus like grading. So I have 150 students in the virtual notebooks. I had like 8 slides. So me going through 150 times 8, no, that wasn't working out. So I think this way would be a little bit better. I hope you guys agree. But as always, I love feedback. I love to hear what you guys think. Okay. All right, go ahead and get started.